What I want to do now is I want to talk about specifically about the landmarks of the pelvis in the pelvic brim cavity and the outlet, because I know that sometimes it's very difficult to follow unless we take it easily and we put it in much more simpler terms. So what we want to do is we know that as the baby is being born, the baby will pass through 3 stages. There's going to be the brim, and from the brim it will go in the cavity, from the cavity until down to the outlet of the pelvis. So what I'm trying to talk about is this. So here we have the pelvis. So this is the pelvis. Of course, this is the acetabulum, and this is the sacrum and the coccyx bone. Bear with me with the drawings. Also, it's the same on the other side. So this is the pelvis, and this is the pubic symphysis. So what happens is the baby is going to negotiate with the pelvis through these structures. There is what we call, starting from the true pelvis, of course, not from the false pelvis, but from the true pelvis. This is the pelvic brim. It's going to run from the sacropromontory. So this is the pelvic brim. The inlet, in other words, that is our inlet. And if we think about this, we would make a, so this is the brim. After this, the baby goes down, and after the brim, we have the cavity. So I think we'll make space here. So we have the brim, and we have the cavity. Now, after the cavity, the baby is supposed to exit the pelvic press, and that is the pelvic exit. We call it the outlet of the pelvis, or pelvic outlet. So here we have the outlet. Bear with me with space. I've just written out, but it's outlet of the pelvis. So the baby going down, descending, enters the brim, that is the inlet, and enters the cavity, passes through the cavity, and on its way out, it's going to pass through the pelvic outlet. These are the ones that we are specifically talking about. And all of these have got diameters. Of course, we do that to monitor the progress of labor and to assess if all the passages are well organized in this woman who is going into labor. Now, what happens is that the press from ear, the diameter from ear to ear is termed as the anterior diameter, anterior posterior diameter. So this is the AP diameter. I think we'll make space so that we make a box. So I think you have, imagine we are talking about the pelvis. So this is at the level of the sacropromontory. This is the inlet. And here we want to assess the AP diameter, because the AP diameter is this diameter, and it's called the anterior posterior diameter. Now, the other diameter is going to run like this, and this diameter is what we call the oblique diameter. So this is the oblique diameter. And the other one is going to run like this. This is the transverse diameter. So we'll denote it with a T. That's a transverse diameter. So this is the transverse diameter. Now, what happens is that I want you to put in mind that the pelvic cavity, the cavity in all areas, in all the diameters, it is 12 centimeters. So I think we will start with the cavity so that we know that it is 12 centimeters in all the diameters. So if you think about the cavity, the pelvic cavity after the inlet, it's going to be 12 centimeters in all the diameters, the oblique, the transverse, and the AP diameter, because it is lunged. It is one at the level. The only difference between the pelvic cavity and the inlet is this, the sacropromontory, because the sacropromontory is going to protrude into the anterior posterior diameter of the pelvic brim. But it is lunged also, except at the area where there is the sacropromontory. So the AP diameter now in the anterior posterior diameter of the pelvic brim, that is the pelvic inlet. This diameter here is lesser than the transverse diameter. In the pelvic brim, the AP diameter is lesser than the transverse diameter, or in other words, the transverse diameter is greater than the AP diameter. And in this case, this diameter here is 13 centimeters. That is the transverse diameter. It's 13 centimeters. And the AP diameter is 11 centimeters. Another point to note, except apart from the pelvic cavity being 12 centimeters, also the oblique diameter in all the entrances of the areas of the parts of the pelvis, that is the pelvic brim, the pelvic cavity, and the pelvic inlet, outlet, sorry, all the oblique diameters are going to be 12 centimeters. So 12 centimeters, 12 centimeters. Now, if you think about the outlet, in the outlet it is opposite from the inlet. We said that in the inlet, the AP diameter is lesser than the transverse diameter, but on the outlet it is different, it is opposite. The AP diameter is greater than the transverse diameter. In the AP diameter, it's 13 centimeters, while the transverse diameter, it's going to be 11 centimeters. So there we have our anatomical structures and our diameters. But in the AP diameter, we have got 3 conjugates from ear to ear, because all these runs from the pubic symphysis down to the sacropromontory. And the way we do this is like this. We are in the AP diameter now, the AP diameter only. So from the symphysis pubis, so here is the symphysis pubis. In flange, and we have this is the sacrum. So here we have the sacrum. So here is our sacrum, and at the sacrum there is the protrusion from which all these conjugates are going to be taken from or measured from, and this protrusion is called the sacropromontory. And all these that we are going to talk about are the 3 conjugates. There is the number 1, I think the next space here. So the first conjugate that we're going to talk about is the anatomical conjugate. And the anatomical conjugates runs from the superior border of the symphysis pubis and towards the border of the symphysis of the the sacropromontory. So it runs from the anterior border of the symphysis pubis down at the back and onto the sacropromontory. This is the anatomical conjugate, and this line is about 11 centimeters. So the anatomical conjugate, 11 centimeters. When we think about the other conjugate is the obstetric conjugate. And this obstetric conjugate runs from the medial border of the symphysis pubis down to the sacropromontory at the back in the sacrum. And this is the obstetric conjugate. This line here, this line is about 10 centimeters. So it is about 10 centimeters. During the general examination, of course, we cannot measure this, but the only one that we can measure when we're doing our vaginal examination is this diagonal conjugate, which runs from the inferior border of the symphysis pubis down to the sacropromontory. This is our diagonal conjugate. And it is about 12 centimeters. So this is 12 centimeters. And this is 11 centimeters. So here we have don't forget, this is the sacrum, the coccyx. So those are our conjugates in the epidiameter, in the anterior posterior diameter.